Hello, GV441 students. I am going to present now the first part of my lecture for week 5 on the Great Depression and the Keynesian model. I felt like because there's a lot of material to get through and it's relatively complicated, it would be useful to do this first. I'll have all the slides with me on Monday when I do the rest of the lecture, and you'll have a chance to ask questions about this. I hope that this will also help you as you read The Means to Prosperity, one of things that we've assigned for this week. Keynes is a fascinating person, and if you're at all interested in him, he's got a really interesting personal life as well as professional life. There's lots to read about him. Grew up in late Victorian Britain, lived from 1883 to 1946, became very famous in the aftermath of World War I when he wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he argued against heavy war reparations. You will have, of course, read about the consequences or some of the consequences of war reparations in the piece by Patel last week. Keynes was an early and important critic of them. In the course of the Great Depression, he worked out an approach to management of the economy as a whole, an approach to macroeconomic management that remains extraordinarily influential to this day. In fact, I have to confess that as I prepared this and reread this material, I was continually astounded by how contemporary Keynes's concerns are and how much scholars to this day use his framework, argue about his framework. This is a really good way into the whole topic of macroeconomics, even now, many years later. And what Keynes did was analyze sources of demand in an economy, sources of purchases, of readiness and capacity to buy things in an economy, and built on the fundamental insight that an economy, a capitalist economy, runs on the capacity of people to buy things because it runs on the capacity of businesses to make a profit, and that's how businesses make a profit. And I think his key point is very straightforward if one thinks about it right. Just think about any successful business in a capitalist economy, one that's making a profit. It must sell more than it pays out in wages, right? If you think of a coffee shop and it sells 100 pounds of coffee a day and it pays out 20 pounds in wages a day, then that's fine. But if it's the other way around, if it's selling 100 pounds of coffee a day and paying out 120 pounds in wages, it's certainly not going to flourish. It's not going to last very long. So any successful business has to have sales denominated in money greater than its cost denominated in money, and wages is one of the costs. So that seems straightforward enough, and we could do that for the whole economy, right, as I've done on this slide. And we see that wages are less than sales. But this raises a very interesting question. If the total amount that all of the businesses pay out in wages is less than the total amount that is sold, what makes up the gap, right? There's this gap there between the total wages and the total sales, and somehow it has to get filled in. Here's another way of doing this, right? The sales price of goods is equal to cost plus profit. Costs are wages and other stuff. This implies that wages are less than the sales prices of goods, and leaves us a question of who's going to buy everything. Well, you're saying, well, what about the profits? Somebody makes a profit, right? And there it is. So maybe that's covering the gap. Well, certainly people who get the benefit of profits do spend on consumption, but, and this is very important to Keynes, this is probably at a lower rate than people spend wages. Why? Because profits tend to accrue to people who are better off. They tend to go to people who are better off, and people who are better off don't need to spend everything they earn. They can afford to save some of it. So that means that a good chunk of the profits are going to be saved, and if they're saved, that's no help. But there is one other source of demand that's important, and that's investment. So if we think about the coffee shop, there's a period when the coffee shop is being prepared to be opened, and people are setting up the tables and installing the equipment and so on. And while they're doing that, they're being paid a wage, but the coffee shop is making no sales. So that is very good for filling up the demand gap, because you don't have sales that are taking money out of the economy, but you do have wages that are putting money into it. Keynes thought through the different sources of demand, the different sources of purchases, and he divided it roughly into 4 categories: stuff bought by consumers, stuff bought by the government, stuff bought by foreigners, and I've written down here net stuff bought by foreigners, in other words, exports minus imports, because if we think about the problem of the demand gap, exported things are sold to foreigners, so we don't have to worry about how much they're getting in wages. They get the money from somewhere, they just buy it, and that is additional demand. On the other hand, anything imported, people purchase out of their wages, which means that part of their wages isn't available to purchase domestic things. So you have to subtract imports from exports to get the benefit of exports for final purchases. So that's net stuff bought by foreigners. And then finally, stuff bought for investment, or wages paid out for investment. If you put all of these things together, you get what we now call gross domestic product. Wasn't a phrase available to Keynes at the time that he wrote the piece we'll be reading for this week, but he's very much thinking in these terms, and the way that we think about the total economy now is very much shaped by his work. So if you were to look up the gross domestic product of a country in the statistics of the OECD or the IMF or the big international agencies, or domestic statistical agencies, you'd find it divided into these categories, right? They break them down a bit more, but the basic idea is household final consumption, stuff bought by consumers, government final consumption, the trade balance, and gross fixed capital formation. Now, from that basic analysis that everything that's sold must be bought, and the capacity to buy has to come from somewhere, the demand has to come from somewhere, Keynes gets to a case for active demand management, for the government or the state taking an active role in ensuring that there is enough capacity to buy what the economy can produce. And he worried that this was not going to come about naturally, that there was no inherent tendency in a capitalist economy for these things to balance out because of the problem of the demand gap. So what did Keynes worry about? Well, he worried that stuff bought by consumers, aside from the issue that wages aren't enough to cover sales, that in a recession or a depression, when the economy is doing badly, employers will think, we're not making enough profit, we can't sell for the price we'd like to sell for because the economy is doing badly. Let's increase our profits by driving down worker wages. Keynes realized that this policy was subject to what is often called the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition is technically defined as the error of assuming that what is true of a member of a group is true for the group as a whole. So let's apply that to wage cuts. If one business manages to get its wage costs down, given its sales, its profits will go up. But what if every business tries to do that at the same time? Well, they all lower their wages, But of course, sales depend on the wages of everybody in the economy. So if every business tries to cut its wage costs at the same time, they may succeed in cutting their wage costs, but they won't succeed in increasing their profits because workers won't have as much to buy stuff with. So he discusses this in the General Theory, which he published in 1937, I believe it was. Might have been 1936, one of those 2 years. And we won't focus on it further here, but it continues to be a very important issue that one can't imagine that it's easy to get out of a recession or a depression by making businesses more profitable by cutting wages because of the fallacy of composition problem. All right, so that's stuff bought by consumers we've talked about. What about stuff bought by government? Well, Keynes worried that there was a prominent orthodox position that took the attitude that the government budget, the state budget, should be balanced. It should have as much in income as it has in outgoings. And what Keynes worried is that a focus on budget balance when the economy is doing badly will just make things worse. And this argument is the origins of the approach that Bloch summarized, if you remember back to the reading from the first week, as the macroeconomic stabilization state. Keynes's idea that there needed to be active management of the amount of stuff bought by government in line with economic conditions gives rise to this vision of the potential role of the state in the economy. And why does he make this case? Well, as you'll be reading in The Means to Prosperity this week, he makes this case because of something called the multiplier. He says, let's imagine that the government decides, in the face of a recession, to spend an additional, call it £200, to promote public works. It's important that the whole argument only works if the government borrows the money to do this, because it's only in that way that this spending creates new wages and incomes. Why? Because if the government does this out of taxes, it takes money out of wages and incomes and deploys it to a new purpose. So it doesn't create any additional wages and incomes, whereas when it borrows, potentially anyway, and we'll discuss this a bit more later, when the government borrows, it borrows money that was not being used otherwise, and it spends it, injects it into the economy. So it's analogous to the role of investment that I discussed earlier when I was going through potential sources of filling up the demand gap. It is spending without sales if it is loan financed, whereas taxes is the analog of tax finance spending is just the analog of spending from sales. Okay, so the government spending gives rise to wages and incomes, and Keynes was facing an environment that actually persists. People continue to make this argument in which people would say, well, it costs too much to generate employment through government spending. Yes, the government, there's lots of unemployed people. It's the Great Depression. The government can go and hire some of them to build things, but the cost of doing that is very high and arguably not worth it. Keynes said you need to think a little bit further than the immediate or direct costs of government spending. Because if you think about what happens to the wages and incomes that government spending creates, well, different things happen to them. Some of them will be saved. Some of the wages and incomes will be saved. Some will get paid back to the government right away in taxes. Some will be spent on imports. And none of those things help to increase output in the economy or increase employment in the economy. However, a chunk of them will be spent on domestically produced goods. And what happens when somebody spends something on domestically produced goods? Well, they create more wages and incomes. So this little circuit here between wages and incomes, spending, and then back to wages and incomes, that is at the core of Keynesian thought. One person's spending is another person's income. And if you think about things in that way, you start to get a picture of the economy as a whole. So let's move things around a bit. We have wages and incomes generated by the government spending. Some of them is going to go away in these different directions. But some of it's going to be spent on domestically produced goods. And then you can kind of see that this goes on, right? That there's a first round, and then a second round, and a third round, and maybe the effect fades each time because some of the spending is leaking away in this direction, but depending on how much goes through, you get an ongoing effect. And in The Means to Prosperity that you're reading for this week, Keynes walked through the calculations you need to do this. He says, let's imagine that the leakages are 30% or 0.3, and that the rest of the spending that turns into incomes is about 0.7, right? So if you imagine the government spending on public works, 70% of that should turn into incomes for someone in the economy, and 30% won't. Then, once you figure out what assumptions you want to make about leakages and spending that becomes income, you can calculate the multiplier being the proportion by which additional government spending increases output, or the coefficient, what you need to multiply government spending by to figure out what its effect on output is. On the assumptions here, and because he remembers from his school days how to sum an infinite series, Keynes can show that the multiplier should be 2. If 70% of spending becomes incomes, then you get a multiplier, an effect on output of government spending of 2. And that seems like a good deal, but he uses 1.5 as a conservative estimate, and then talks through the why he feels it's sensible to increase government spending and loan-financed government spending if that's a reasonable figure. Now, Keynes emphasized that the multiplier effect only works when the economy is in a position to increase its output. He says, if the resources of the country were already fully employed, additional purchases arising from the government's spending would be mainly reflected in higher prices and increased imports. Slack, by the way, is just the term for something that's loose, like a slack rope, like the one drawn here, is one that isn't pulled tight. So it's just a reference to the capacity to expand. It's often called the output gap these days. And discussions of how one judges the output gap and how one judges what it means for resources to be fully employed and indeed for workers to be fully employed are very, very hot topics these days. Again, almost 90 years after this stuff was written, the issues Keynes put on the agenda are crucial policy issues that get debated every day in the councils of economic policy making. Keynes's argument is an argument for stimulating the economy when the economy is doing badly and it has excess capacity. If it doesn't have excess capacity, then this extra spending by the government will just give rise to higher prices. People continue to have arguments about what the multiplier is. I've put in the suggested reading further reading, couple of pieces on this, which give different answers to how we ought to think about the multiplier, and it turns out to be fiendishly complicated to figure it out from actual economic data because there are so many different interacting factors. My own position is that given that there are so many different interacting factors, and it's so hard to figure out from economic data, one would want to have really good reasons for rejecting the reasoning that Keynes gives, which, as he says, and I think convincingly, once you step through it, it is quite common sense. But if you look at the estimates of the multiplier, there's certainly no question that in recessionary conditions, Keynes's 1.5 is a more than defensible conservative estimate. Now, there are people who say that the right answer is 0.3, which is that an extra pound of government spending gives only 30 pence in extra output. There are people, this is a matter of big debate, but given that people on the side of the lower multipliers can give few reasons for why they ought to be so low, my own view is that the people who are promoting higher multipliers have the better case. At any rate, it is, again, quite remarkable that this thing put on the agenda by Keynes is still very much a matter of political and policy-making debate. We'll talk more about that later in the term. So the key implication of the multiplier analysis is this. Austerity, trying to balance the budget by cutting spending and or raising taxes in a weak economy, can be self-defeating. It just makes things worse without effectively improving the government finances. It gives up the opportunity to employ unused capacity, and the contractionary effects multiply, just as expansionary ones do. So Keynes steps through an example where the government is expanding its spending, but of course if the government is reducing its spending or taking in more in taxes, you could do the whole argument in reverse, and the contractionary effects multiply just as the expansionary ones do. So, we were developing Keynes's case for demand management. We've talked about his concern that employers may pay workers too little. That's built into the nature of capitalism, that employers will pay workers too little to cover the cost of everything they sell. But especially in recessionary conditions, trying to drive down worker wages is not going to be a solution. Stuff bought by government, a focus on budget balance in recessionary conditions, can just lead to a spiraling down of the economy rather than restoring the health of government finances. You will see when you read the Means to Prosperity that he does have a discussion about the effects of confidence in government's ability to sustain its borrowing on interest rates, and that this makes things a bit more complicated, but we can talk about that in seminar. The next category of potential demand is net stuff bought by foreigners, and Keynes points out quite reasonably that one country's exports are another country's imports. And this means that any particular country can say, oh, our economy is not doing as well as it needs to. Let's figure out how to export more. But if every country does that at the same time, then not all of them can succeed in expanding their economy that way. So what he suggests is that one country, by pushing its trade balance to be more positive by trying to export more and import less is withdrawing employment and spending power from the rest of the world. For when one country improves its foreign balance, it follows that the foreign balance of some other country is diminished. So again, we get a kind of fallacy of composition problem. And it means that there needs to be some sort of policy to address this. Just imagining that any individual country can fix its economic problems by exporting more is not going to give a solution for the world as a whole. And then the last category of things is stuff bought for investment. And Keynes worries here, for reasons that I will talk more about when we meet on Monday, that relying on investment as a source of demand makes the economy as a whole very dependent on whether or not businesses are ready to invest and business people are ready to invest. And Keynes believes that businesses and business people are characterized by fickle moods, by changeable moods, by what are sometimes called animal spirits, but also moods driven, so animal spirits, just kind of instinctive or pre-rational feelings about what's going on in the economy, but also self-fulfilling prophecies and lots of things that can shape investors' attitudes in ways that don't necessarily contribute to an level of investment that's consistent with full employment. And so again, Keynes thinks that this requires some sort of active government policy. Okay, so that's what I wanted to go through today, just to get you ready to read The Means to Prosperity that you'll be reading for the seminars this week, and to give myself more time to talk about how the Keynesian model affected international arrangements and to answer your questions about how the whole thing works. So I'll see you all on Monday.